Hello and welcome to Church at Home with Rachael. My name is Rachael Parker. My pronouns are she and her, and I am an Anglican priest in the Diocese of Edmonton, Anglican Church of Canada, and I serve in the parish of Dayspring Ministries, which is St. Mary's Edgerton, St. Saviour's Vermilion, and St. Thomas in Wainwright. I apologize, I got a little bit of a cold today, so might sneeze or need to blow my nose partway through this video, but it's that kind of time of year. It's a whiteout as I'm taping this. Can't see if the park across the street from my house, and glad to be in a cozy warm office with my dog at my feet. Dude is a good pair of slippers. He's 100 pounds, a chocolate lab, likes to keep me warm. Last Friday, I posted a video about Bo, the fifth column, and his talking about churches and the evangelicals and things like that, and had a lot of really incredible comments come back, and I really appreciate that. And a lot of it came back to things like authenticity and believing in God and not believing in God. A lot of atheists responded, and I love that. That's not something I know a lot about, so the more I can learn, the better. But yesterday morning, on the 28th, as I was doing my daily office and my morning prayers, I was reading from this book. It's called Common Prayer, a Liturgy for Ordinary Radicals. It's very subtle, but every day there's a little bit of a passage from a radical or somebody who sort of started to change the world in quiet ways. And today it says here about Erasmus of Rotterdam. I'd like to share this with you. It says, a 16th century priest who was committed to reforming the church from within said, "When faith came to be in writings rather than in hearts, contention grew hot and love grew cold. That which is forced cannot be sincere, and that which is not voluntary cannot please Christ." That really spoke to me, considering the comments I was reading over the weekend about my previous post, because there are a lot of people who are recognizing that the church has done the greater, North American church anyway, has done a great job of the writings, of the telling people what to believe. Not every denomination does that. And one of the gifts I find in the Anglican or the Episcopal, that's the American style of Anglican church, is that we have this thing that we call the via media, the middle way, that we have room. It's like if you're walking in a park, and it's got big, really wide pathways. So there's room. You can walk down the center. You can walk down the right. You can walk down the left. There's room for everybody to be there on the path together, even if they don't agree about everything all the time. There's lots of room for, I don't want to say right wing, but there's lots of room for more conservative thinking. There's lots of room for more liberal left thinking. And there's lots of back and forth and opportunity for dialogue and the give and take of exchange of beliefs and ideas. And when we do that at our best, now granted, like everybody, we're not perfect. So when we do that at our best in the church, we open up possibilities for conversation. We open up possibilities for people to learn. And so when he says here, when faith came to be in writings rather than in hearts. So that really spoke to me, because this idea of what is written down, when it's written down, I think it becomes almost, in some cases, sacrosanct. It was written down, so it can't be changed. Things to be written down, they're important. Laws written down are important. Driving on the right side of the street in North America, important, because if it wasn't a law that was written down, it would be chaos out there. We'd have people driving all over the streets, and people would be getting killed and hurt, and pedestrians would be nailed in intersections all the time. There are times when it is really important for us to write things down and to make them sacrosanct. Absolutely. And the Bible, I think, is a great example of something being written down. I think the problem comes when we stop remembering that it was written down, my take is, it was written down not so that we would come to look at the Bible and say, this is exactly what God said. This is exactly what we need to do. Rather than it was written down so that it wouldn't be forgotten. That, it's like when kids play that game telephone, I did this when I was a brownie. When I was about 6, we played telephone, and I remember about 30 of us and sitting in a circle, and I started it, and I said the blue bird was sitting on the red barn, and by the time it came back around to me, it was an eagle sitting on an apartment building. Don't know how that happened, but this, when we have things that we have written down because it's important that we remember what was actually said. It's what we do with those things that are written down. And when we abuse that, when we say, no, this is, there's something like the criminal code of Canada. It's very important that it be written down and we follow it to the letter. Absolutely. I don't personally, this is my thought, I don't believe the Bible was meant to be written down like the criminal code of Canada many centuries later. I think it was meant to be a reminder. It was meant to be a repository of stories that might not get passed down. We're living in a world up here in Canada anyway, in which we're really working hard at trying to understand and build relationships with the Indigenous communities, the First Nations communities. We're working on truth and reconciliation, and part of that reconciliation is recognizing that we settler types do things really differently than the Indigenous types, and one of those things is how we hold our stories. As a white person, as a Caucasian, somebody whose background comes from Europe, my history of stories is to write them down. My grandfather was a big journal writer. Every day he would sit down and write things down. It seemed awfully ridiculous because he'd always have what the weather was like and how many crops they brought in or who was working on the farm, things like that. But when looking back now on 100 years ago and realizing when he started, those things are now important. They pulled together, they tell the story of who he was, Joseph L. Murray, what he offered to the world and what he took from the world, how it helped him to grow. So for him, writing his story down was important. And for me, as his granddaughter, it's important because then I can learn more about him now that he's gone. My way of doing things. For our Indigenous siblings, the writing down thing, I can't explain it because it's not mine to explain. My hunch is that in the writing down, something gets lost. It's like when different ethnic groups or different peoples don't like to have their picture taken because it seems they believe it captures the soul. There's something to be said for the spoken word, the story being told and interpreted. Does the story need to be 100% the way it was 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, yesterday? Sometimes I don't think so. I think maybe it's the moral of the story. It's the teaching that comes out of the story that is more important, rather than the writing it down and this is exactly the way it's supposed to be understood. Because even when we write things down, people still interpret them. We interpret not knowing the context, or even if we know the context, we apply our own thinking upon that context. Listening to, if we listen to things that the Apostle Paul wrote to different groups of people, each having a different context and different problems or concerns or questions that he was answering that we don't know, and then we conflate it all and say, this is what Paul thought. What Paul thought for the Romans may indeed be quite different than what he thought for the Corinthians, etc. But by writing it down, we make it sacrosanct and we can't work with it. We can't play with it. Maybe there is something to be said for what Erasmus has said here. When faith came to be in writings rather than in hearts, contention grew hot and love grew cold. That which is forced cannot be sincere, and that which is not voluntary cannot please Christ. I think he's right. What do you think? I think that we need to think, and we need to take Scripture seriously, but we also need to recognize that Scripture is writing. It isn't everything. It is not every word that Jesus thought, not every word that God has spoken. And it has a context that we don't always pay attention to. So just some thoughts on writing things down and Scripture and how we deal with such things. What do you think? Have a good day. God bless. Hopefully I will see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.